Hello, and welcome to the Health GoLIVE Webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Intelligent Medical Objects. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions for the panel throughout the discussion. Our speakers would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Chitra Nawbat.
Welcome to today's Health Go Live. I'm Chitra Nawbat, investor and growth advisor to venture capital and private equity-backed companies and moderator of today's session. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists and invite each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Rajiv.
I guess it would help if I took myself off mute, right? Hi, everyone. Rajiv Haravu. I'm the Senior Vice President for Product Management at Intelligent Medical Objects. In that capacity, I manage a product vertical called Insights and Analytics, where that includes managing products for normalizing healthcare data, and part of that is application of natural language processing to extract insights from unstructured clinical narratives. A quick background, I've been with IMO for now 5 years, but my background has been in healthcare and health IT pretty much for close to 2 decades now. Started off on the laboratory bench, moved into working on, after graduate school, moved into working with health information exchanges and worked on some research informatics projects dealing with cancer that was funded by the NIH, and worked with pharma and med device companies building middleware software. Worked in healthcare AI companies before I joined IMO, and have had a great time here working on a whole range of products dealing with ontologies and dealing with natural language processing and dealing with normalization of healthcare data. It's so great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Frank?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Frank Mannion. I'm the Vice President of Innovation with Melex Technology, now part of IMO. We were recently acquired. Our company was basically focused on natural language processing applications in health IT and research. The company was been in existence about 4 years. We had one of the top rated natural language processing engines, as well as a whole suite of tooling that actually supports both the health and research life cycles. My background is I have a PhD in biomedical informatics, and I have worked in healthcare and research, specifically in very deeply in cancer informatics for the past almost 4 decades. So I'll leave it at that.
Nadia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Lupnova. I'm Vice President at Hallmusk of Real World Evidence. My background is in epidemiology, working with data ranging from genetics to large population level statistics, inclusive, of course, of structured and unstructured data sets. And at Hallmusk, I work with a very talented team focusing on real world evidence in behavioral health.
So let's dive into the conversation. Natural language processing. These terms are artificial intelligence, generative AI, natural language processing. Overused, where people might not fully understand what this stuff actually means. So let's baseline for everyone, including ourselves. What is natural language processing? And then if you can share some adoptions at scale in healthcare. Rajiv, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that's a great starting question, right? So, natural language processing, at least to me, is a sub-discipline of a much larger discipline called artificial intelligence. I know it's a very overused term in today's environment, but in the healthcare perspective, let's look at a real world example that all of us can associate with, right? So we all are patients in one form of another, of some physician somewhere. And when we go to the doctor, what do you see the doctor do? You see the doctor sort of type up all the information you're giving him or her into an electronic medical record. And most of that is not going into most of that really good information, useful information about your health and your background, your family history, is not going into neat little columns and rows into a database. They're going into a document, right? They're going into a narrative written by a clinician, and those are all like a treasure trove of information that are going in there. So now the question is, how do you use that information, both at an individual level, how do you use that information trapped in these free text clinical narratives? How do you use it for an individual healthcare and also a population level sort of healthcare as well? And it's impossible to use humans to be able to read every single piece, every note out there for every patient, and to be able to abstract it and make these decisions. So to do this at scale, you need algorithms. And that's where natural language processing comes in. So to provide a non-computer scientist definition of it, is a set of algorithms that you use to extract relevant information from these free text clinical narratives algorithmically and make it available so that decisions can be made about treatment, decisions can be made about inclusion in clinical trials, decisions can be made about inclusion of patients in population health initiatives and things like that. But the NLP in healthcare, presents a very distinct challenge, right? So when you see a radiology report or a pathology report, when I've been subjects of radiology procedures and pathology procedures personally, and when you read that, it's hard to understand it. It's written in English, but it's really not English, right? So you need to be part of a trained tribe of clinicians to be able to understand what's written in there. So you have to look at every specialty in healthcare as its own language, right? It's not English. It's as its own language. That means when you write an algorithm, if you use an algorithm that's trained on plain English that's grammatically correct, it's not going to recognize any of those documents. So NLP is a discipline, but NLP in healthcare is a very specific discipline that understands these language models. There's another buzzword I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about. Understand these language models, and each specialty in healthcare is its own distinct language model, and they are trained to understand that. So that's a layman's definition, I would say, of natural language processing, using a subdiscipline of artificial intelligence to extract insights from free text clinical narratives.
Nadia, your take?
That was an incredibly good summary. I think this is also what you ended with, Rajiv. The NLP in healthcare is a very specific aspect to NLP overall, because generalist NLP versus healthcare NLP are they're going in parallel, but they're developing in different rates. So a lot of the techniques, a lot of the methods that have been developed, let's say roughly 10 years ago, are only now being adopted in healthcare NLP, and that is going faster these days. But because it's such a different field, a lot of things don't translate that well, which is actually different the other way around. If you develop something in healthcare, it translates relatively well to the general NLP aspect. And a very concrete example of that could be when you think about, let's say, what Rajiv just talked about, radiology images, reports, and let's say tagged imaging things, so you can look at them from side to side, is very different at how general NLP and tagged imaging works with. So let's say you have a picture of something and you have a description next to it. Usually it describes what is in the picture, whereas in healthcare, some of it, yes, describes what is in the picture. A lot of it is outside of the picture. There's, no pleural effusion, for example, or no other tumor, or no other disturbances, which is a very difficult way to think about for a machine, whereas you're talking about something that is not in the picture and you need to make inferences in that. So this is just one example of how different it is and how complex NLP applications in healthcare are.
Frank, you've been working in this space for a number of years. What are adoptions at scale from your side of the puzzle?
So most of our adoptions from my side of the puzzle have been really in academic medical centers at this point that are pushing the boundaries of what can be done in specific disease areas. So as Rajiv has said, the vocabularies that are highly specific in a particular field. So we've done a project with one major hospital in Texas where we were looking at a particular rare disease condition, and we were able to apply NLP across a large subset of the patients that present at that large hospital to determine when they had a condition, this rare condition called HADS. This was actually a pediatric use case, but it's basically a cohort. In our case, what we were using it for was basically discovering a rare disease cohort. So it's, and it's quite feasible to do, but it really does rely, as Rajiv was saying, on that specific vocabulary around that particular disease. Now, I want to level set around one of the things when you think about NLP and even AI, but NLP in specific, there's a couple different things you need to consider. Natural language processing has the ability to recognize what we call named entities, which are particular snippets of words or phrases that represent a particular concept. Often there's a need to code that concept into a structured vocabulary of some sort or to a standard, be it one of the standards like ICD-10 or SNOMED or our IMO terminologies, or in the case of research use cases, particular data dictionaries that have been derived by statisticians in the process of building their research use case. Part of the problem is also understanding the relationships between the various named entities. So we have two fundamental things, or three really, that NLP does. It recognizes vocabulary, it normalizes those named entities that it discovers to a common vocabulary system, and it also then recognizes relationships between those named entities as they occur inside of the text that is being parsed. So it's important to keep those things in mind. Those are the key things that NLP can do at scale. Now, if you have the ability to do that, one of the things you're then able to do is take that information and apply other algorithms and other decision support mechanisms on that data. You can put it into a database, you can build clinical decision support algorithms about it, you can use it for cohort discovery. So there's you can use it for infection control. You can use it for clinical trials operations, clinical trials discovery. All of those operations are feasible with natural language processing once you have standardized the text through NLP.
Can we go a little bit further in terms of some of those specific examples you talked about? Let's talk about infection control and then clinical decision support. Frank, if you can, bring it to life, just do the pull through, make it very sort of more tangible for us in terms of then how this flows into infection control or clinical decision support, because you're getting into, this is all of the category of patient care, right?
Right.
So when people think about patient care, there's a diagnostic component. There is the actual care component, whether that's preventative or after the fact, after you've been diagnosed with something. So if you could, take us through more specifics using infection control as an example, and then clinical decision support.
So one of the use cases that we have in a tool that we've constructed at MELX is the ability to go to index using the standard terminologies. This is a tool called Vital that we've constructed to go through all the medical records in an electronic medical record system. The system can be instructed to find particular terms, free text terms or structured terms that may occur in a given unit. So for example, a given floor of a hospital or a given operating room, or for a given diagnostic or a disease use case like MRSA. this system can, essentially parses the entire medical record. In cases of some large hospital, it can be millions and millions of records. It indexes that according to terms, and then allows physicians and infection control personnel to search those quickly to say things like, show me all the MRSA cases that occur in this part of the hospital. And that's a real world use case. It's been used not just with our technology, but other people's technology to look for disease and infection control in a health system setting. Another case we have is a exploratory project we're working with now with a major academic medical center on the East Coast, where they are looking into Alzheimer's. And the idea here is we are studying what can be done to, with high resolution, high precision, high accuracy, understand early detection of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And that's going to be we're using the NLP to develop clinical decision support algorithms that will ultimately be able to be embedded into the health system's electronic medical record system to do best practice type alerts right at the point of care.
Nadia, building on what Frank just shared, how do you think about this in terms of how the maturation of this over time? Because earlier in your comments, you talked about natural language processing coming to other industries outside of healthcare much earlier, 10 years ago, now coming into healthcare. So healthcare adopting this technology later, still relatively nascent compared to other industries. So what does as this technology matures over time, especially in the examples that Frank just talked about, infection control, clinical decision support, what can we expect in the future? 5-10 years from now, what does this look like? What are we working towards?
Oh, that can easily turn into my own wish list. So I'll be I'll be careful about that. I think one aspect is certainly actually getting it into a clinical decision-making environment, because currently a lot of examples are operational, which are really helpful. But as Frank has mentioned, a lot of the efforts are limited to research, not to say that it's limited, but how does it transcend into clinical practice is a whole nother aspect. And that is very challenging. It's a long way, but I think in 5 to 10 years, we're going to see some of the aspects going into it. And as Frank has mentioned as well, NLP is a lot about extracting and understanding data that is captured elsewhere that we are not able to, for example, to use currently. And there's a lot of it. Most symptoms are not coded. They are not found in structured data, but they are so informative for early diagnosis, identifying risk groups. All of those are associated with clinical decision making. So I think in 5 to 10 years, we're certainly going to see something already transcending that barrier. But there's a lot to go. In terms of the technical aspects themselves, much more specific models, so NLP to address different clinical challenges. We do have a few models that are broadly clinical. We, of course, also have models that are targeted to oncology or to neurological diseases. I think that will go deeper and deeper and be more and more specific. And with that, more precise. So that barrier jumping into clinical decision-making will be a little bit easier. And of course, I will mention the buzzword, but I do want to see where generative AI will take us, because there's a lot of promise, and MedPalm 2 is out. I am interested to see where it's going to go in 5 to 10 years.
And Rajiv, on the operational side, your thoughts, because all of this, of course, saves manpower, time, speed. Get into the operational benefits.
So I think one place where it's been heavily used already is the computer-assisted coding, clinical documentation improvement workflows, right? So it's heavily used there. It's about, a simple workflow like, the doc forgot to put the discharge diagnosis in there. And how does a CDI specialist, get to that discharge diagnosis? Ultimately, the doctor has to sign off. I understand that, but it's reading through multiple narratives that for a patient, for a particular patient episode in a hospital, and being able to infer some diagnoses, which you can then confirm with the doctor. So that's been happening for a while. And I think from an operational perspective, it's heavily used there. Data entry into registries, disease registries, right? Especially in the oncology space that I've been exposed to. Use of natural language processing to help registrars do data entry into registries has been there for a while, and it's improving. And I think it's improving every day in the sense that there are systems out there that will that will learn as the human registrar teaches this algorithm over a period of time, and more of that data entry function will get automated, because these are, in the end, especially when you're talking about generative AI, these are learning algorithms that will learn over time, right? So that's also being used heavily. Clinical data abstraction, right? That's the first step in. We can talk about downstream uses of NLP, but the first step for me is, okay, let's extract everything that's out there, and then we can start to think about making predictions and inferences. Like clinical data abstraction is like, how do you extract everything that needs to be extracted from these documents? And that's where at least my group's focus within IMO is, let's help people extract problems, diagnoses, procedures, labs, medications, SDOH data, genomic, like phenotype data, and then not only extract them, right? Not only what Frank said, named entity recognition. You're saying, yeah, this is a word, and I think this is a problem. No, this is a word. These are two words. They're related, and they have a clinical concept, and then they get codified to a standard terminology like an ICD-10 or a SNOMED CT or a human phenotype ontology. That's what we do, and I think that's important. That's important because once you do that, you are setting the stage for downstream analytical applications to be able to use what was extracted to do inferences, do predictions. Until that happens, it's still, it's stuck. It's stuck in this narrative that nobody can read, or, and then it's not being used. It's just being filed away in a cabinet somewhere, right? A virtual cabinet, but a cabinet somewhere. So that's there's a lot of work that can be done. And I think the large language model, I know it's a buzzword, but I think it's an important development just in this clinical data abstractions, because they can do it at scale, right? One of the great things about LLMs is that they're really good at extracting this stuff. They can be trained to be really good at extracting this stuff, and they can do it at scale, right? And that's what's happening. That's what will happen. So in a hospital environment, there are everything is a note. It's a free text note. Hey, the patient wants a wheelchair. That's a note, right? Not only radiology and pathology reports, every simple thing is a note. Like, how do you process all these notes? And you have to do it at scale and to be able to extract it. And then when you extract it and codify it, now you converted something that was completely unstructured, completely free text, and converted it into a fully codified, structured representation of that data. Now the analytics companies can come in and say, now I can query this, I can massage this, I can write predictive algorithms on top of it. That's the downstream uses of data. And that's, for me, that's the greatest. So in terms of the future, we're doing sentiment analysis about, Frank can probably talk about what Melax, because he's at Melax, doing sentiment analysis on social media feeds about a particular vaccine, right? And they've done this work before. And that's really exciting. Especially you live in post-COVID times, like, how do people perceive a particular vaccination? What are the barriers for them to take a vaccination? Those are some of the exciting things. And also making more data available at the point of care. Like, how do you extract, if somebody wrote a narrative and it's sitting there, nobody's reading it, and a doctor has 15 minutes with each patient or less, maybe I'm being generous. Like, how do you surface all this data in these narratives up to the physician or the clinician treating the patient so that they can make timely decisions, and extracting that, again, clinical data abstraction, and then making it available in a clinical decision support application at the point of care. We are working, something that we are passionate about. So those are some of the trends that I see.
So going more deeper in terms of what Rajiv talked about around data extraction. For you to extract data, first of all, you have to have data that's available. Then is the data reliable? And then how do you actually, then the so what, right? So the data is reliable. Then how do you actually apply artificial intelligence on this data to get to actionable insights? So let's kind of break that down. Nadia, if you can talk about the use of artificial intelligence, whether it's natural language processing, generative AI, or other subsets of artificial intelligence around data quality, and then we'll get into the insights piece with Frank. Nadia, on the data quality.
Yeah, data quality is a massive aspect of NLP and everything that we are doing with machine learning or AI in healthcare and beyond healthcare. And data quality has multiple facets on its own as well. You mentioned data availability. This is one of the biggest thresholds for adopting a lot of things in healthcare, because data availability is not there. It's not financial sector. We constantly struggle with having data there and then having it adequately answering a specific question that we're looking into. And it is there, of course, for a good reason. There are a lot of ethical concerns about how these data can be used, where are they sourced at, what is in the data. So there are a lot of concerns in that. And actually, NLP can help with de-identification as well. So it helps in its own narrative as well. And what does it capture exactly? Whether it's adequate to answer the research question, I think sometimes this can be lost, especially if the goal is a little bit diluted. So data quality has to be assessed before NLP. What is the structure then? What is it? A lot of domains have to be described. And then after that, we still have validation steps to validate the NLP itself and whether it's mapped correctly, usually done with eyes on data from a clinician. We don't move away from that point. There still has to be clinical validation at the very end of it. And only then can it go into analysis.
Frank?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to build a little off of what Nadia said. There's been a lot of talk. If you go to NLP vendors, you hear a lot of talk about things like precision and recall and F1 scores. And in fact, the point that Nadia just made, the clinical validation, the validation of the NLP for the data to be fit for the purpose it's designed to, as opposed to numerical scores and accuracy given in mathematical terms, has to be done. There has to be validation at the end of the development of NLP-based algorithms, because they're no different than you would treat a decision support algorithm that you were building to put in your EHR, for example. Even if the data is only going into a register or something, you have to do that validation step. It's absolutely critical. So I just recommend to the audience that they be very careful not to be wowed by F1 scores and precision recall and those types of numbers without looking at that clinical validity. There's a group at Stanford that just actually published a paper on this. It's actually on their blog at Stanford. You might be able to find it. Nigam Shah is one of the authors. He's a very well-known clinical informatics, bioinformaticist out there. But very, very important. So anyway, moving on, Chitra, to your question. Could you repeat it, please?
Talking about actionable and actually getting to actionable insights, right? So, in terms of how natural language processing, how any of these AI sets of technologies are used to actually get to actionable insights today, and then how that evolves over time.
So Rajiv actually mentioned it's not particularly clinical per se, but the insights that are being derived from the social media data for vaccines. For example, we actually have two major pharmaceutical companies that are working with us on those projects. It's quite possible right now to apply NLP to social media. The downside, the hard thing about NLP is right now as it exists before generative AI is the length of time it takes to do the annotation. So these models have to be trained. They're trained by human annotators going in, highlighting phrases, going through multiple rounds of training. with generative AI, because so much pre-training has been done, if you think about what these chat GPT, for example, the GPT, it's a generative pre-trained model. Okay, the P and the T stand for pre-trained, right? GPT, yeah. And they basically have that information on what is a word, what is, what are these terms, because they've been trained on enough text, both, standard internet text, corpuses of books, but also scientific reports, scientific publications that are out there on the web that, maybe a layperson doesn't know about, but the scientists know about them. They're easily accessible. So we no longer necessarily have to go through those multiple rounds of annotation just to get at the named entities. So things are going to accelerate because of these models. We're going to be able to do that type of work quicker. And the downstream implications of this is we're going to have this data. So how do we use the NLP and the large language models to do this vaccine social media analysis? Well, we use some of the tools that have been used for a long time, trend analysis, autocorrelation analysis, a variety of decision support tools. But we can also then take those patterns as we discover them using standard methodologies and apply them to AI, use them to train one of these generative models or a similar type model that's only looking at signal data, such as might be coming from the social media feeds, but also might be coming from a laboratory instrument, and start using those in turn to do that type of decision analysis. So that's when we start threatening to make a small joke here, to start threatening the biostatisticians' jobs. But that's how that I see these things evolving, as these models are going to be applied in more and more places to do this type of analysis downstream to give insights. And, some of those are going to have to be generally trained for specific fields. Some are going to be more general in what they're able to do.
So if you're a pharmaceutical company or you're a payer or provider that's trying to figure out what to do here, Nadia mentioned this earlier, right? Which is the application of natural language processing, especially in clinical decision support and actual patient care, is like even earlier, much earlier than the operational side. Rajiv and you, Frank, have just talked about the use of signaling, social media, right? Natural language processing and social media to identify issues around whether it's vaccination or other. I mean, pharmaceutical companies, frankly, have been using signaling and analyzing signaling in social media for at least 5-6 years, not only around vaccines, but drugs, whether branded or unbranded, et cetera, and patient issues or any issues with usage of drugs and side effects. So definitely pharmaceutical. Social media signaling and the use of natural language processing is already been there for at least 5-6 years. Other areas where there is concentrated effort around, bringing natural language processing to life, the benefits of it to life, right? If you're a payer or a provider, like where and how are payers and providers focused right now? Nadia and Rajiv, if you could talk about that, and then Frank, maybe the question to you will be, where will pharmaceuticals take this next? But Nadia and Rajiv, if you can talk about, if you're payers and providers, like where's the place that you should be making your bet on how to really invest and bring this to life? Nadia?
Question, I can take a first pass. I think one of the areas is where payers and providers and clinical pharmaceutical companies meet is where clinical trials and recruitment starts and takes place. Because a lot of one of the biggest pains overall in real world data, real world evidence, or observational studies is that a lot of information is not coded, it's not captured. It's very important, but symptoms, for example, or a lot of clinical scores or quality of life metrics are not usually captured. And pharmaceutical companies are usually, especially these days, are developing drugs to address symptoms, to alleviate burden in everyday life. We, of course, are worried about life expectancy, but currently a lot of drugs try to address not life expectancy on its own, but the quality of life. And that quality of life is described in different ways. None of them, or very few of them, are coded. And this is where hospitals are and providers are very interested in having those data available to try to bring their patients closer to clinical trial, because there are cases where this is incredibly valuable for the patients themselves. And this might be the only option to get a novel or an alternative medication plan. And it also is an incentive for pharmaceutical companies to find those patients and quickly assess whether they would be suitable for a clinical trial, and of course, accelerate their own pipeline. And both sides can do the same thing and have their own incentives, but produce one product.
Rajiv?
So yeah, I think no doubt, right? Clinical trials there's an aspect of clinical trials that's where even the definition of what a clinical trial is free text, right? I just wanted to bring that up. Is if you've ever been to clinicaltrials.gov or any sort of website where these clinical trials are actually published, it's free text narratives, right? To understand it, you have to be a scientist to understand what they are doing, right? And there are lots of clinical trials in play here. And even to understand what clinical trials are being conducted in the US and maybe around the world, is that it's hard for a human being to just keep up with that. Like, how do you summarize which clinical trials are in play? So can you take those free text narratives about clinical trials and make it accessible, easily digestible for an end user, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a pharma company, whether it's a scientist at an academic medical center, or whether it's a researcher at a pharma company, but also maybe a clinician at the point of care. Like maybe he or she is treating a patient who could benefit from a clinical trial. But how does a clinician know that a clinical trial is happening somewhere that they could actually recommend their patient to, right? NLP has the potential, whatever techniques of NLP you use, a supervised approach, a generative, whatever techniques you use, that could be used to extract information from these databases for clinical trials and make it available at the point of care for the researcher at a university, for a researcher at a pharma company. So that's one. And one favorite topic of mine, and Frank knows about it, is systematic literature review, and where I just think that that's a huge task right now. I think it's largely maybe there are, I may be wrong, there might be automated methods applied, but this is a largely manual process where a group of people read large amount of publications about a particular subject, given a certain particular set of criteria, and then summarize the findings in a certain structured way in an Excel spreadsheet or however they do it. Now, there are 5,000, just PubMed alone, I've heard that it's like 5,000 articles a day. Like, now, how do you keep up with that volume of publications, right? And I think systematic literature review is of great interest to me. It's great interest of Frank and others and his colleagues at Melax Tech, and they've done it before, and they've done it really well before. And that's another aspect of it. And systematic literature review is used by health economics outcomes research departments within pharma companies. It's used by clinical trials people within pharma. It's used in academic research centers. It's used everywhere. And I think it's an area that that's exciting for me personally, and I think it's an exciting aspect for many in the industry as well.
Can I just comment?
Yeah,
Can
sure.
I comment
Go ahead.
one thing on that? So there's been a number of studies that looked at how much money pharmaceuticals and academic medical centers spend on that right now. I think the average cost of a review, I think pharmas are conducting somewhere, I forget exactly, but it's around 100 per year at a rough cost of $500,000 per systematic literature review. So you can see the potential benefit of anything that speeds up that cycle of review discovery. And oh, by the way, right now, those types of reviews have to be refreshed manually. and they, you know, if it's an active drug or an active area of development that the pharmaceutical or the academic center is interested in, then they have to be refreshed. And so there's a concept emerging in that space called living systematic reviews, where that refreshing is happening on almost a real-time basis. So it changes the whole paradigm of publication and data support from something that's paper-based or text-based at the least, into something that has a real live dashboard database behind it that can be looked at, you know, periodically and according to whatever the needs of the research are.
Right. And actually, just to add one more thing, I think this is a real life example as well, as FDA is either developing or close to having finished an NLP model to extract toxicity effects across different submissions, across different documents, because they need to review it, exactly as Frank said, constantly. And it's a never-ending process, and they're developing it right now to facilitate their work.
I think another, just, you know, I think maybe this is not a direct answer to your question, but you did ask about gazing into the crystal ball and seeing what's coming. And I think there's also everybody's focused on large language models and then, you know, this and generative AI, two different things, but related. Yes. And I think, everybody gets excited, right? You go into that context window and you type in your question and it gives you an answer. But there's another aspect to this, right? So, like, for example, you know, most of us, we at IMO are, you know, we've been dealing with semantics of data. What's the meaning of of a clinical concept for the last 30 years, right? And I think anybody who works here, you know, is passionate about that. And you know, this pairing of generative AI LLMs with this concept of ontologies, which essentially is a structured representation of a particular domain, and pairing of those two things to improve transparency in what an algorithm is telling you, right? To improve the inference of that algorithm, that ability to draw inferences from a particular input for a particular input. That's something that's, you know, this whole concept of semantic AI. I don't want to pile on another buzzword on top of a buzzword, but this whole concept of a semantic AI is important. This pairing of ontologies, the structured representations within of data within healthcare with large language model with generative AI is very important, because I think when these LLMs are very good at processing free text at scale, but what these ontologies are really good at is, you know, something that we are very passionate about at IMO is essentially having structured representation of data. And then when you combine these two pieces of technology and they are related and attached at the hip, then you start to really see some really interesting stuff, because now you're able to do inferences and predictions that, you know, much better. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Let's get into the technology environment, because natural language processing, generative AI, any of these things, it's not like they're like Excel or PowerPoint or Word, where they can just be installed on your desktop or laptop and away they go. It doesn't work like that, right? And healthcare, especially on the provider side, has relatively less, still earlier in terms of proliferation, adoption of sandbox, cloud sandboxes, sophisticated technology platforms and so forth. And so what is the technology environment that these organizations need in order to enable and actually be able to do and use natural language processing? Rajiv?
Yeah, summarize your question. I don't think I fully understood your question, but could you help summarize your question?
So people might be wondering, okay, yep, I want to embrace this technology, natural language processing.
Okay.
How does my technology environment need to be enabled, right?
Yeah.
What type of level of maturation do I need to have in my platform, in my IT architecture, in my infrastructure in order to do this? Because then the follow-on question is, coming in from the audience is how do vendors integrate with IT ecosystems, right? How is it enabled through Epic or Cerner? How do health systems, especially providers, how do they bring this to life?
Yeah, I think these are, especially when you're in the realm of LLMs, these are computationally intensive algorithms. So I think that's the aspect that most of us are enamored by what it can do, but there are costs associated with it. I'm not an expert in that field, but these are highly computationally intensive, and that means it's associated with higher compute costs for a provider and for any organization that's planning to deploy it, right? But there are also questions about LLMs hallucinate. We know this, right? So what are techniques you use to reduce that hallucination to be used in a clinical workflow, right? So how do LLMs are good at telling you, wrong things in a very convincing way. That's pretty much a layman's term of hallucination. Like, how do you can't have that in a live clinical environment. You're going to get, there's a danger associated with that. Those dangers are obvious. So how do you, before you adopt it within a clinical workflow or an environment, how do you prevent that? What are the techniques? There are techniques out there that you can prevent that. And I think you do that. So I think that's, then the question is transparency, right? This whole concept of responsible AI is very important. All of us eventually are going to embrace this, but how do you embrace it responsibly, right? I think this would be, and you asked me the question from an IT perspective, but an IT department leader obviously has to wrestle with these questions. Like, how do you, for me, responsible AI is about transparency, right? How do you show the end user how you got to a particular prediction? Like, how do you do that? So that they trust what that algorithm is telling you. So those are some of the higher compute costs, the techniques to prevent hallucinations, the transparency, right? So that you can guard against things like bias within an algorithm. And it's a huge issue. So those are things that IT leaders and clinicians together are going to have to wrestle with when they implement things like generative AI and LLMs within the clinical environment.
And what are some of the other factors that leaders should think about? Like, for example, regulatory.
Yeah. So regulatory is data privacy. I think there was a question in the Q&A is about, like, what techniques would you use? Like, can you use a SaaS-based offering that's out there? I think there are many ways. I think one of the things that we've been seeing, even without the use of LLM, just generally using traditional methods of NLP, like, supervised machine learning approaches, there's a lot of concern about PHI and PII, because free text clinical narratives, the PHI, PII can be distributed across the document. It can be everywhere. So the question is, de-identification is one if you're using a SaaS-based offering, but also we are focused on taking it to on-prem, like, having an on-prem install of a particular, NLP solution to calm the fears that somehow their PHI could be compromised, right? So containerization of these solutions and deployment within a customer's environment is a big priority for us. I know Frank has his hand raised, so I'll let him respond to that as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and the question in the Q&A was actually about HIPAA compliance. I think one of the things that hasn't been touched on is the concept of information leakage, not just de-identification, as Rajiv was talking about, but information leakage from the LLMs. That certainly is a threat with the current models. If they're deployed without other mechanisms in place, other controls in place. I think, although I'm no practical experience doing this, but I think, again, one of the things to think about as you consider implementing these in your own organization is these types of tools can be pipelined. so that one tool feeds into another tool, feeds into another tool. In fact, the tools that my company, Melex Technologies, actually built were built around the idea of hybrid pipeline models that could imply machine learning, deep learning, normal statistical techniques, dictionaries, et cetera, and run them in a sequential fashion. And I think if you think of these tools in the same fashion, you could easily conceive of if you already have a de-identification or an HIPAA, information leakage tool to back-end the LLMs or the generative models with those types of tools, that would be a potential way to get around some of these problems. It's just you have to think about how do you compose them as tools, not as singular atomic, one AI to solve everything. Think about them as part of your toolbox. So I'll stop there.
Nadia, your thoughts on any of the factors, barriers, risks?
Yeah, to mirror everything that has been already said, and probably just a thing to add is a lot of the companies who work in a space of healthcare data do have a massive limitation, which again is there for a reason, of data not being able to travel to many other places. So for example, me working in behavioral health, data that we have access to now cannot be submitted to any other instance. And this is why we need to develop and apply a lot of NLP tools in-house. So a lot of the knowledge that can be reused, but they can't necessarily be submitted to other platforms. And that is with all patient data, which has to be respected, because again, information leakage and accidental PIH leakage is something to be taken very seriously.
Before we get it, go ahead.
So another couple of other aspects is the continuous monitoring, right? You deployed it. It's not deploying and forgetting it. How do you continuously monitor the performance? That's so important and also you have to think about if something goes wrong, then what is the liability? Those are liability issues. I'm sure people are thinking about those, and how do you think about those? So those are all considerations that I think IT leaders, in conjunction with their clinical leaders within their organizations, are obviously considering while thinking about the power of these technologies.
Nadia, I want to get in this one question from the audience. What about evidence-based research solutions that leverage RWD rather than published literature?
Oh, plenty. I'll again contain myself. There are very beautiful examples in oncology, because it's a very broad field and there's a lot of interest and there are a lot of different applications, and real-world data is playing a more significant role. And it's probably one of the few areas in healthcare that became a prime example of how real-world data can be used and effectively used in healthcare. So from anything from extracting progression and what exactly progression means and all of the aspects about the progression or recurrence of a cancer, there are quite a few beautiful examples that have been published. And those have been tested as well. So they had some pressure of time and scrutiny, and they have held quite well. Moving into the side that is still developing, but has had a few papers published, and this is also what Holmusk is working on, is more behavioral health and also concepts that are quite difficult to measure. So say social determinants of health, we briefly touched upon that. There's a lot of knowledge about social determinants of health, for example, impact in health, not only very physical, but also mental health. But those are terribly difficult to quantify and extract. And real-world data in this case is a very significant ally, and NLP using on real-world data is a significant ally in understanding where can we translate all of these insights and where it can help. So for example, there was a beautiful study, I think in the veterans database on social determinants of health and suicidal behavior, so either attempt or suicide. And some of the concepts that, again, are never coded have been found to be very highly associated with that outcome. For example, legal problems and loss of home. So there's a perfect opportunity to intervene. So say you for example, you are a healthcare provider and you see a change in any of those circumstances that you would need NLP to extract and to monitor, because it's impossible to read every single note. You would need those aspects to be presented quite quickly. You have a chance to intervene and prevent a very dramatic outcome. And that's just one of the cases that I think is going to mature further as well.
And Nadia, another question for you. Someone mentioned, mentioned CDS a while back. Do you know successful examples of CDS helping clinical care and oncology?
Sorry, CDS?
Clinical decision support.
Oh, yes, of course. They are usually local. So this is a boring yes or no answer. In terms of it being transferable across different countries and across different settings, no. I don't think there's anything that is uniform to that degree. In terms of local, either hospitals or systems or specific cancer focus, yes, there are specific clinical decision groups. They can range from preventing certain outcomes. So for example, monitoring patients on certain medications and trying to prevent toxicity or capturing toxicity to certain medications and addressing that in a patient setting very quickly. So this is almost NLP providing a label and that label being a trigger. So kind of code red, have a look at this patient. It needs, the medication plan needs to be assessed, and also managing some of the aspects of the treatment as well. On top of that, operational aspects. So diagnosis of cancer or a lot of other conditions is not straightforward. It's not one sit down to determine what is actually happening. And the whole chain of events includes a lot of professionals that are not necessarily working in one department. So having NLP directly summarize what has been found at each of the steps and present it to another person in the chain of making a diagnosis, for example, or developing a treatment plan has been quite useful.
Do you envision combination of NLP and RWE leading to clinical decision support tools that are more broadly used?
Certainly, because a lot of the actionable insights or actionable aspects that I think the whole healthcare community is trying to address are, a lot of them are captured in free text notes. And we, of course, want to focus on a diagnosis because that's usually the starting point. We need to identify patients that we are trying to look into deeper and what is actually the pain point in those groups. But the actionable insights, rarely the diagnosis itself. It's something that happens before or something that happens after. And this is where NLP can really help because it describes the patient journey much better.
Rajiv, quick question before we close. Something came back in on cloud computing and storage has completely replaced in-house high-performance clusters.
Yeah.
Based on the recent advances in AI and the topics that we discussed today, will HPCs make a return?
So I'm not an expert on high-performance clusters, but let me tell you how we are approaching deployment options for NLP solutions that we are building, right? I think we want to give our customers, and I personally believe that it's important to give them a flexibility in terms of deployment options. And I think more often than not, people are choosing to deploy these in-house, right? I think Nadia alluded to that in a certain context, and I think we are seeing that more and more, especially within provider segments, where I think the primary concern is about leak of PHI and PII, right? So, and that's, I think, so we have no choice but to offer our customers a range of deployment option, and many of them will choose to deploy this in-house, either in an air-gapped environment or a slightly different configuration. There are many approaches, like my architects have coached me on, as like this concept of a control plane and a data plane, and where you isolate all the processing on at a particular customer side, but you have a control plane that can be hosted. So there are many different combinations, but what we are focusing on, and I think it's safe to say that's a trend, is that customers need a range of deployment options, and a lot of them, when they're concerned about PHI and PI, are considering on-premise installs of these solutions, and that needs to just be an option for our customers more and more.
That concludes our panel. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and thank you to our distinguished panelists, Rajiv, Nadia, Frank, for sharing your insights. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you to our speakers and to everyone that joined us today. Please visit our website at hlth.com to catch up on all Health Go Live webinars. And join us in Las Vegas, October 8th through 11th for Health 2023.